Now back to the Andrew Lawton Show on London's breaking news leader, AM 980.
Welcome back to the program. This is the Andrew Lawton Show here on AM 980, tackling a topic that has been generating a lot of discussion online. And every time we raise the subject of firearms, there's obviously a huge discussion around it. So I wanted to have a debate on a question that gives us some latitude to expand into different areas. But the question, which has been agreed to by both of the gentlemen joining me in studio, both gun owners, is, are Canada's gun laws too strict? And from the Canadian Shooting Sports Association, we have Director John Evers and author of the bestseller Arms, The Culture and Credo of the Gun, AJ Somerset. Both of you, thank you so much for coming in. It's great to have you here.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
So the question, as we've told you all, is about whether Canada's gun laws are too strict. We're going to have a pretty free-flowing discussion here. I'm going to get involved and kind of play devil's advocate to both sides, but ultimately I want you guys to have it out here to make your case. John, you're arguing yes, so why?
Comes down to basically Section 92 is my problem. The gun law, as I said now, which is a descendant of C-17 and C-68, was a knee-jerk reaction to a cold technique. There wasn't a lot of thought put into it. It was just the government saying we must do something. Conservatives came out with C-17, which clamped down on legal gun ownership. That was followed up politically by liberals who really needed to one-up the conservatives in terms of the election. They came out with C-68 to further clamp down on legal gun ownership. And that's where the whole impulse was. It was all that gun ownership is bad. And that's why we see it show up in Section 92 of the code, where ownership of a gun itself is illegal. Just possession is illegal. It's de facto illegal in Canada. We then give you permits to break the law. So the idea of criminality of gun ownership is the main problem I've got with it. There's a lot of intricate details, and that's the problem people get into. The law is vast. It's convoluted. It's hard to explain all the niggling details. There's a lot of constitutional issues in it where gun owners are treated worse than criminals are. We're assumed to be criminals strictly by our interest in firearms, and that needs to change.
AJ.
Okay, well, actually, that's Section 91. I'm not going to bet you $1,000, but it's Section 91. And that's actually really, I think, the heart of why people feel that the gun laws are too restrictive. But to me, this is a kind of emotional reaction to what is in that section of the criminal code. If we take a step back, it's a fact that in the hands of a person who is violent or careless, a firearm is inherently dangerous. So we have a legitimate reason for wanting to regulate firearms. At the same time, there's legitimate reasons to own firearms. So what we want to do is we want to say these people are trustworthy. These people are not trustworthy. We're going to let the trustworthy people own guns. That's what Section 91 is actually doing. And that's really the heart of our licensing system. That's the idea behind it. I don't think that it's onerous or unfair on gun owners. And, as for our laws being too strict, we've got 7 straight years of growth in the number of licenses issued. Shooting sports are growing. We've got another gun shop here in town now, so we have 2. They're advertising on the radio, which amazes me that there will be a good enough market to justify that. So the shooting sports are growing. The shooting sports are doing fine. We're not being stamped out as gun owners. It's basically a reaction to some really unfortunate political rhetoric in the past, which is true, that has tended to treat gun owners or gun ownership as morally bad, which it's not. And that reaction is preventing people from seeing clearly. So we're not thinking about our gun laws. We're feeling about our gun laws and reacting emotionally to regulation.
I wanted to ask you, John, a lot of people would look at the mass shootings we see on a regular basis out of the U.S. where gun control is very lax, and then you look to Canada where it's very strict, it's licensed, it's regulated, and that in and of itself to a lot of people says that our gun laws are working. How do you dispute that?
Oh, quite simply because you just said American gun laws as it's a monolithic sense. It's not. The American phenomenon is quite different than Canadian. We have a federal, AJ agree that we have a federal gun law in Canada. It's across the country, one gun law. American experience is far different. It's down to the county level. So you look at the instances where you have lots of mass casualties and high levels of gun violence. Those generally the areas in which the gun laws are the harshest. Look at Chicago as a prime example. And people always say, well, we need to stop, have guns in the areas like that. Well, they're there and they're pretty much illegal. You look at Washington, D.C., the areas that have lower gun laws towards the law-abiding citizens, Vermont, for example, they don't see those instances high. So it's really a case-by-case basis you have to look at. So once you dig deeper, it's not that carte blanche.
And this brings us, AJ, to this age-old, law-abiding citizens are the only ones impacted by gun laws. How do you really dispute that criminals are the ones that are ignoring these laws?
Well, law-abiding citizens are the only ones who will obey the gun laws. But by making firearms illegal for criminals or unqualified people to own, what we do is we force those people to trade in a black market. And on the black market, the risk and cost of dealing in firearms is increased. So that, for example, a gun like a high-point pistol, this was quoted in a Toronto Star thing a number of years ago, costs $150 in Cleveland or wherever. Here in Canada, it runs $1,000 for a criminal. And that's because of the risk of smuggling it into the country. By increasing those risks and costs, we price the petty thug out of the gun market. So the gang member who's dealing in drugs, he can still get a gun because he's got the money. But the guy who's robbing gas stations can't. And we can see that effect in Canada where 2012, if you were being robbed in Canada, you had a 12% chance of facing a gun versus in 1975, almost 40%.
You see also you talk about the drugs. The drugs are illegal too. So smuggling is smuggling. You're going to have it no matter what. The licensing, and I agree in terms of training. I want trained people. I got no problem with a permit system. It's criminalization I have the issue with. So I don't want criminals to have guns. I don't want the untrained to have guns because I'm next to you at the gun range. So training, permit systems are fine. It's to criminalize that. The default move is criminalization is where I have an issue. Otherwise, yeah, smuggling, it's bad. Drugs, bad. Illegal guns in gangbangers' hands. Those are bad things. AJ and I can agree on. It's how you get there is we have a difference.
But if you're going to push for permits and training, isn't that still doing what you said was problematic a few moments ago, which is where gun ownership is de facto illegal unless you've earned the right to?
That's what we need to get rid of. Exactly. That aspect. When you license expires, you're driving a car. When it expires, you don't become an instant criminal. You can own your car. You can't drive on the street anymore. That's the program we have. And as a director of Canadian Shooting Sports, we've been training people for decades in gun marksmanship, how to handle safely. We want safe people. It's back to if you become a paper criminal instantly. It's the aspect that, the gun ownership is immoral. We need to change that.
What do you think, AJ? Can it be dealt with as more of a regulatory issue when people run afoul of these myriad guidelines and rules instead of a criminal one?
Well, it is true, of course, that when your driver's license expires, you don't automatically commit an offense until you turn around and drive your car down to the licensing office to renew it. But, firearms are a little different. They're not cars. And so I think it justifies a difference in how they're handled. Now, the point that John is raising, which goes right into Section 91 and this fuss over Section 91, is that the way that Section 91 has been interpreted by the courts, the possession of a firearm without being the holder of a license is an offense. And it's an offense as the courts have interpreted it so far, regardless of how you came not to be the holder of the license. So if it expired and you haven't renewed it, then in theory that's a criminal offense. Now the thing here, though, is the actual cases where this might be justifiable, like I got hit by a bus and was in hospital and couldn't renew my license, or the RCMP dragged their feet in renewing my license and it didn't get to me before it expired, or I applied just 2 weeks before and it takes 45 days. Those haven't been tested. So there's an opportunity for the courts to read more into this law that isn't there, which frankly I believe they would. But the fact that the law as written tends to convict on the basis of the mens rea element of possession, that is something of a problem and it's causing a fuss. Yeah,
and it's also reverse onus. I need to prove I have a license as opposed to them proving I don't. We're assumed guilty and I must prove my innocence. And that's not the way our court system is supposed to work. I'm supposed to prove my guilt, not prove my innocence.
Is that an apt comparison, though, with firearms ownership? Should the onus be on the owner or should the onus be on the government?
Well, as far as the reverse onus goes, that's in being the holder of a license. Any place in the criminal code where there's a reference to being the holder of a license, an authorization, or a registration certificate for a firearm, it places the onus on the accused to prove that he's the holder of that license or whatever. And the complaint has been raised that this is unconstitutional because it's a reverse onus. But the bad news on that is that there is a case, Schwartz, in the Supreme Court in 1988, which is actually before Bill C-68, which was to do with an offense of possessing a handgun without being the holder of a registration certificate, the same form of the law. And the court said that's not, A, it's not a reverse onus at all in the court's mind, and B, if it were, it would pass the Oakes test and it would be permissible.
We've got to take a quick break here. We're tackling whether Canada's gun laws are too strict. Joining me in studio, best-selling author AJ Somerset and Canadian Shooting Sports Association Director John Evers. Back in a moment here on AM 980.
You're listening to The Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980.
Welcome back to the program. This is The Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980. Worth noting here, both of the debaters just acknowledged this. All of us are probably, certainly them, in agreement on a lot of things here. And this is why I think it's interesting to have this dialogue, because we're talking about the broader philosophy here of Canada's gun approach, Canada's gun laws. The question we're debating is, are Canada's gun laws too strict? John Evers saying yes, AJ Somerset saying no. This maybe doesn't fall under strict per se, but one area where there seems to be a huge amount of criticism from gun owners in particular is about some of the arbitrary nature or certainly convoluted nature of some of the regulations. I know one recent one that came up was limiting magazine capacity for 22 rifles. And for people that don't know 22 rifles, we're talking about a very small cartridge here. And the fact that these can change with such speed and make people overnight offenders. Where do you stand on these sorts of changes? I mean, do you find, AJ, that the way these issues are changed is where it should be in Canada?
Well, when we talk about the 1022 magazines, for example, or more recently, there's been a fuss about some AR-15s that the RCMP believes should be prohibited because they're more easily converted to full auto than others. This is a real thorny thing. Typically, the gun activist type of person will say, well, this is illegitimate. The RCMP is making the law. And the fact is the RCMP isn't making the law. They are interpreting the law that is there. And they're making a decision on how they're going to treat that law and carry that into court. So you can fight that in court. The problem is that their analysis is usually pretty good, and you're probably going to lose. So it's as if they're making the law, and it just, I think, offends people. And what offends people the most, I believe, the real underlying cause of people taking offense to this is that there's a feeling of A, a lack of transparency, and B, no possibility to appeal. So the RCMP makes a judgment. We have no access to how they made that judgment, and we have no ability to fight back against that judgment without exposing ourselves to criminal liability. So there was an example, the Army Jaeger AP-80. This one, the RCMP came out and said, well, this is prohibited as a variant of the AK-47. Well, it's a blowback action, so people said that's wrong. Somebody took it to court. His name was Henderson, Ontario Court of Appeal. He lost. And he lost because it is identical, made in the same factory as the Mitchell AK-22, which is on the prohib list. And it just has a different nameplate. But he didn't have the opportunity to appeal that without actually exposing himself to a criminal penalty. And there isn't the transparency to see why the decisions are made, and there isn't the opportunity to argue back against them without going there. And that, I think, is why people really feel the RCMP is making the laws when, in fact, strictly speaking, they're not.
How many areas do we really see that happening in?
More and more, and it's not really the RCMP, it's a civilian technician who actually at the heart of this. A civilian technician makes a determination. And look at the Army Jaeger. Yes, the Mitchell Arms 22 was prohibited, but why was it prohibited? It was prohibited because it looked scary. It's a 22, Andrew. You can go grab a 22 at the local gun shop today, semi-automatic, same capabilities as the Mitchell, as the Army Jaeger. And if you look at the Blaze 47 is a prime example case where you had two identical rifles, one with AK-esque furniture, one without. The AK-esque one was the team prohibited because it looked scary. That one was fine. It was a non-restricted. So that kind of determination shows the RCMP really doesn't know what they're doing. The technician makes mistakes.
Well, the Blaze 47/Blaze 22 is maybe the one really good example of people, the RCMP, making decisions on firearms based on their appearance, because it seems to have been based on its appearance. There doesn't seem to be any other reason for it. But really, in most other cases, it's not to do with appearance. It's to do with technical characteristics. In the case of the Army Jaeger, it was the fact that it's the same as the AK-22, which was prohibited by politicians, not by the RCMP.
We just had the VZ 858, which had Canadian furniture that had a Canadian flag and like Moulin Labe engraved in the wood of the furniture. It was determined that was now prohibited because of it.
Well, this is a good one, because what happens there is the RCMP had said CZ-858 proof 2007 or later is going to be prohibited because it's no longer the same rifle as it was before that we were treating as non-restricted. So that may have had some validity, but politics, Stephen Blaney, Bill C-42, Stephen Blaney then reclassifies it by order in council back to non-restricted. Then along comes an importer who wants to import this CZ-858 with a different nameplate on it and some engraving and so on, and he offered it as a new model. And this gave the RCMP the opportunity to prohibit that model because it wasn't the model named in regulation. People may feel, I think with some legitimacy, that that's a little bit unfair, that the RCMP is playing word games in prohibiting that rifle.
But herein lies, I guess, the more fundamental question here, because we're talking about a system where gun owners have to basically live and die by what law enforcement do in practice and on paper here. Underscoring this is the question of whether in Canada we have a right to gun ownership. And I'll put that to either of you. Do we in practice, and should we?
For me, it comes back to property rights. We actually you don't have a right to the shirt you're wearing. Okay, it's quite simple. We don't.
I like this one though.
You look good. You look good. So we don't have property rights. So do I have a right to my guns? No, I don't have a right to anything. So I believe in property rights as a base value.
So you believe there should be a
Property
fundamental
rights
right to gun ownership?
To anything.
So guns you put in the same category as a couch or
As
your
a
shirt?
kettle.
Okay. AJ, is that fair? Can you lump guns just simply as a matter of property in Canada?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. The first is that actually we do enjoy property rights in Canada. It's not actually named in the Charter because it's a provincial matter, but Section 26 of the Charter says that just because it's not named in the Charter doesn't mean it's a right. So I think
it was supposed to be, and Trudeau pulled it.
I think it's fairly clear that they're imported into the Charter through Section 26. I mean, we have property rights. You can't have your property arbitrarily confiscated without redress. As far as whether we have the right to arms, we don't have the right to arms. So there's two answers here. One is that you don't enjoy the right to arms. However, if you bought a gun and you own it now and the government tries to take it away, then there is a property right involved.
We've heard examples of where guns have been subjected to a classification change. People need to turn them over. They don't get compensation for that. Is that something that needs to change?
Absolutely. I've got prohibited firearms that when I die, can't be willed to my children and will be gone. That is confiscation over a long time. It's, like boiling a frog.
Is the status quo in that area working, AJ?
Well, this is one area where, if the government declares something prohibited, they can, in theory, take it away from you without compensation. I personally don't believe that's right. There's a mess with these grandfathered prohibited firearms where, in the past where they were grandfathered seemed like a pretty good deal, but the value of those has disappeared as a result of them being prohibited. And people may not have understood that was going to happen at the time. They just wanted to keep those guns. But as far as whether, if the government turns around and bans semi-automatic rifles tomorrow, should they compensate Canadian gun owners for doing that? Absolutely, they should, because there's a lot of money tied up in those. And the government, if they say society has an interest in, making these illegal, then surely society should be prepared to pay the cost of doing that.
Would it be fair to say, just to make sure we're in a fundamental point of agreement before the next thing I'm going to say, would it be fair to say that the primary purpose of classification of firearms is public safety? Or that should be?
Politics.
Is it fair to say it should be public safety?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So if a firearm is prohibited because presumably it poses a major risk to society, you'd think they wouldn't allow people like John to keep it. You'd think that firearm should be classified as something that there shouldn't be any of. So how do we have this hierarchy, basically, where some firearms owners are able to have some types of guns, even though they've all gone through the same training and the same certification? Is that not proving that our laws could need a bit of a refreshing?
It is just separation of classes of gun owner. It's making prohibited owners, restricted owners, separating them. There's no difference being shot from a SKS 76239 or of an AK-47 S1. There's no difference in the end user. So it is just they have a different look, so we can separate them. A short-barreled handgun under 4 inches. So I've got a GP100. It's actually larger than my Glock. The Glock's restricted. The GP100 is prohibited. And there's no logic behind it. It was just trying to break guns into discrete points and aim and hit them one at a time. You pull away. I call it the law of Pez dispensers. You take the top away, there's a new top. So you got rid of the full autos, pop. Got rid of converter autos, pop. New top, new top. And AJ quickly was able to say, they could ban semi-automatics. That's the next top of the list. They've got rid of everything above that.
Well, this takes us into the classification mess. So the first thing that's going to happen is, unfortunately, John and I are going to agree again, which is not going to make for, a very exciting or violent debate. But there is a big mess in the classification system, and I think everybody on both sides of the debate acknowledges this. There's no logical reason why an AR-15, from a public safety perspective, why an AR-15 should be considered restricted while a functionally identical semi-automatic rifle like
AR-180,
Mini 14 or
whatever.
something.
Oh, don't buy a Mini 14. No, please.
All of those guys are non-restricted. But this is not just to do with, people complain this is all about the looks of the firearm. It's not to do with the looks of the firearm. There's historical reasons for this. At the time that this was done, politicians essentially looked at the market and said, well, we don't want to get into a great big horrible fight with people trying to take away Mini 14s and stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to ban current military firearms. So they banned the M16 and they banned or restricted, as the case may be. They put controls on current military firearms or then current military firearms like the M16 and so on. And they even went so far as to dig into the catalog and see that Heckler & Koch was working on the G11, which was an upcoming military firearm, and they banned that. But the things that were traditional civilian semi-autos, they left in place. What's happened is in 2004, when the assault weapons ban, Clinton-era assault weapons ban in the States expired, the market exploded with zillions of new models. So now we have all kinds of new models of firearms which fit the criteria to be non-restricted in Canada because the prohibition or restriction of those semi-autos going back to C-68 was done by order in council rather than by firm criteria.
I have to take a break here. We will pick this up on the other side here. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980, joined by John Evers and AJ Somerset. We'll be back in a moment. Stay tuned. We are back. This is the Andrew Lawton Show here on AM 980, talking about gun control in Canada. Our Canada's gun law is too strict, and it's always encouraging when we find more agreement on these issues than disagreement. But it also means that when there is agreement on an issue that something is perhaps needing to change, the government should probably listen to that. Joining me is John Evers, director at the Canadian Shooting Sports Association, and AJ Somerset, author of Arms, the Culture and Credo of the Gun. Let's talk about some of the more contentious issues when we are dealing with this in the public, which is that people seem to associate, like you were talking about earlier, guns with bad. People make that immediate connection. And I've thought, if I were to walk through a parking lot on a legitimate trip to get from, home to the car, holding the gun, not doing anything with it, even in a case, if someone knew, I know there would be the cops called. And that's the culture we live in. So is that where we should be? Is it okay for gun owners to kind of be in this little offset category, not really of much note to everyone else? Or should we make guns more enshrined in Canadian culture? I've been reaching out with that. If you look at the work I did at East Ogden Sportsman in terms of open houses, we were doing yearly open houses. We've had some scheduling difficulties lately, but we were having that to reach out to show people this is okay, this is fun. My girlfriend, she was a gun owner, and she didn't let anyone know that she was a gun owner. And she's a physician, and she was like that. No, I don't want people to know that. And why? Oh, my patients might not like that. Meanwhile, my best shooting buddy, he's a doctor,
and he goes out shooting. So it's really, that's your mentality and what you did and why you're ashamed by it. And you get that whole, when you go to the gun club, one guy goes walking out and going to shoot a handgun. He looks at you, can I take pictures? I'm like, sure. Oh, so this is legal? And I was shocked. I stood right there. It's like, it's that bad. The shame on gun ownership was that bad. And we basically did it ourselves, where it became very exclusive. We didn't open our doors. We didn't want people in our world, and we shunned media in particular. We wouldn't let media anywhere near our gun clubs. And we shot ourselves in the foot, so to speak. We didn't do that. It's outreach.
Can you have that openness, AJ, without it devolving into really what you've talked about in your book as far as that overly sort of bravado nature of guns?
Well, I think you can. There's a question of context and there's a question of how you present yourself as a gun owner. And, when John says we did it to ourselves, and, John, I know, is talking about people, the community turning in on itself rather than reaching out to a broader public. But the other aspect of doing it to ourselves is there are, unfortunately, a lot of people in the gun community who are bad ambassadors for the gun community because they say nutty things all the time. When you have people talking about how they ought to be able to shoot somebody in the back because he stole their television, that's not being a good ambassador for the gun community, because you paint us as a bunch of essentially violent loons, which plays into the worst possible stereotypes. And I mean, these stereotypes are often silly, but there is always somebody there trying hard to validate them. And those people are really, I think, causing the biggest problems for the firearms community now. I
know this gets outside of gun control specifically, but one area where we've seen a lot of legal issues in Canada is with self-defense, when someone's used a lawful firearm in self-defense. And if you look at a lot of the comments people are making on, gun forums and whatnot and gun Facebook groups, people are, I'd say, advocating for the right to use their guns for a lot more than the law, as I understand it anyway, seems to allow. Is that your sense as well, John, that people want to be able to use guns for more than the letter of the law permits in Canada?
The law does allow it, but it's always about reasonable. And it's hard to define reasonableness.
That would be the in the back that AJ was talking about versus.
I'm saying, you can't be defending yourself. Our laws, our storage laws, we do have concealed carry. We talked about the last debate. We do have concealed carry in Canada. It's just very hard to get. And we're getting this whole other world that's not the reality in Canada. We don't have widespread concealed carry. There's no open carry. You talked about walking along with a gun and people just go rabbit hunting. We just don't see that anymore. We've gotten away from that world.
Should we be able to have concealed carry in Canada? If someone's going through the training, the safety certification, the legal check, is that something that in Canada should be allowed? More so than it is now.
More so than it is now. That's a real red herring in there that, we're going to have that in Canada. We're not going to see it. I don't see it in my lifetime. Lots of guys want it. And, I go the whole thing that I've got a fire extinguisher, why not a gun? We don't have the crime rates we have in Canada. We don't have a lot of that. Naturally, it's the drug dealing. It's the breakdown of culture. You do see that in states. But the problem is, in the states where you see concealed carry go in, crime rates tend to drop. So there's, is it a problem? Is he a risk to society if he was carrying concealed? Probably not. Is a police officer off duty carrying concealed, is he a risk? I should hope not. So it really becomes a debate of lifestyle. What do you want to see?
Do you buy that concealed carry does result in crime going down?
No, I don't. I think that, John Lott has argued this at length, but the problem is that the methodology that John Lott is using is essentially a junk science methodology for the purpose it's being used for. Your statistical models are not useful if they're not predictive. So if you can't predict what crime rates are going to do using those models, which they've never been validated to do that, then you also you can't use them to analyze what has happened. And this applies equally to Lott's critics, who use the same methods to reach the opposite conclusions. This method of multiple regression analysis just isn't valid for the purposes being used for. So I don't buy his findings at all, and I lean towards what Gary Kleck says, which is that he thinks it's not pushing it one way or the other. If you're looking at your murder rate isn't changing significantly because of people doing concealed carry. On the other hand, I would disagree with John. Concealed carry is inherently a risk. There is a risk that guy has a gun. It's the same as if I muzzle sweep you at the range. You don't accept me saying, "Oh, my finger was off the trigger," or "Oh, it wasn't loaded." You're going to boot me off the range quite quickly, because that creates a risk. Even if maybe I knew the gun was unloaded, it's a risk. So there is a risk associated with concealed carry. The problem in trying to detect an effect of that, of course, is that the risk converts to an actual shooting quite rarely.
Right. Most of the concealed carry uses aren't reported. It's brandished. The incident drops because the guy's got a gun. And again, it's really off the topic for Canadian society. We're just not even – we have a hard time not banning a semi-automatic. And we've got their gun enthusiasts that want to have it now, and Canada's not prepared to even have that debate. We're talking about the magazine capacity for a .22 caliber rifle. That's the argument we're at right now. Concealed carry is not in the numbers.
What is for both of you then the ideal gun law? I mean, we have the conservative leadership race right now. Aaron O'Toole saying he wants to scrap the Firearms Act, start from scratch. What would the ideal be for both of you? I'll start with you, AJ.
Well, I suggest there's not very much wrong with our laws as they stand now. Most of the problems that we've talked about where, when I talk about transparency with the RCMP, that's not a problem in the law. That's a problem with the agency that's actually enforcing the law. So most of our problems are not with the laws themselves. The problems lie with the way they're being implemented. So that can use some cleaning up. The only real problem area in our law surrounds classification, and that one's not getting resolved. And the reason it's not getting resolved with the classification of semi-automatic rifles is John will say they should all be non-restricted. And when Cook here at the Coalition for Gun Control, they'll say they should all be prohibited. And no politician wants to wade into the middle of that because it's just a no-win. So they're going to remain probably as they are.
I want to actually talk about that because you're right. I mean, if you're going to change it, some people would say, all right, let's put everything up on restrictions. Other people would say, let's bring everything down. Have to take a break. We'll tackle that when we return on The Andrew Lawton Show. Stay tuned.
Now back to The Andrew Lawton Show on London's breaking news leader, AM 980.
We are back. We have to, unfortunately, keep the sponsors happy. So every now and then you tap into a really good point of discussion and then you've got to take a break here. But we are back with the firearms debate, the gun control debate, and we left off on classification here. And you touched on this, AJ, that obviously if you talk about semi-automatic rifles as one example, you're going to get some people like John, as you noted, who agreed very happily that want to say, all right, let's make them all non-restricted, and others that are going to say, let's ban them all. How do we navigate that, John? Because if you're saying you want there to be consistency, sometimes that's going to be consistency towards more restrictions.
Well, it's just a matter of, evidence-based. What's the difference? What's the difference in muzzle velocity from that gun, that gun? What are the capabilities? Furniture, if I put a spoiler on my, station wagon, does that make it a Porsche? No, it makes it a bad-looking station wagon. So it's what can it actually capable of? What's the risk factor of it? And if you look at we were agreeing on that earlier, then AR-15 versus an AR-180, one restricted, one non-restricted. Actually, in my collection, I've got three. I've got the same magazine, same cartridge, 223, can be fired out of a non-restricted, a restricted, or prohibited. Your choice. What's the difference? Where's the logic there? And in the existing system, there is no logic. It's emotion. It's fear.
Is that where the discussion really comes down to, AJ, emotion and fear?
Well, no, as I said earlier, I think that there are historical reasons why it winded up this way, based on originally an intent to make military firearms restricted or prohibited. And then the market has since 2004 exploded, and there's so many more of these semi-automatic rifles on the market. Which creates this incredible inconsistency. But, the question that you put to John, really what it comes down to is not all firearms present equal risks. And an AR-15 is not a .22 caliber single-shot bolt-action rifle. One is obviously a greater risk to public safety than the other. If all of these semi-automatic rifles that, as a class, it's easy to identify this class. They got interchangeable box magazine, holds 20 to 30 rounds, or is nominally holds 20 to 30 rounds, legally restricted to 5. And they fire, usually the intermediate cartridge, in some cases a full-bore rifle cartridge. It's easy to identify this class. So the question becomes, well, what's the appropriate way to treat all of these rifles as a group? And, if that can of worms is opened, if we ask if the laws are too strict now, if that can of worms is opened, I guarantee you they're moving into the restricted class. That's going to be what happens if the can of worms is opened.
I have more
when
faith
politics
in
is done.
I think if once you prove
we're not talking about humanity, we're talking about government.
Yeah,
it's important to keep that in mind.
But it really depends on the government in place, right? If you look at it, it was It's just, we're talking aesthetics. So a 223, a Browning BAR is a box-fed magazine. You can get high-capacity box magazines for it. It's in 30-06. It's in 308. We're talking technical terms here. But it's still, what's the end result? Muzzle velocity? Is there an interchangeable magazine? Doesn't really come to a play. I keep asking people why we are limited to 5 rounds in a semi-automatic rifle in Canada. The only reason I can come up with is somehow killing 6 people is bad, that we're somehow too polite in Canada. It's like, why? How about killing one person is bad? Go after the people who are killing people. Stop that. The mechanism really doesn't matter.
Well, I would answer that. You know, every army in the world now issues a 30-round box magazine.
But not a semi-automatic. You keep calling these military firearms. They're not. They're semi-automatic firearms. No military issues semi-automatic firearms. And we keep calling them assault weapons. They're not. They're semi-automatic rifles. We're trying to call them sport utility rifles. It's the same idea. It's a plinker.
But the soldiers are trained to use these in semi-automatic mode. Selective fire rifle. You're firing it on semi-auto most of the time. You're only using full auto in circumstances like house clearing. So the semi-auto rifle really is – I mean, they're not military firearms. That is true. The semi-auto rifle, though, is really functionally very similar to the rifle the military is using. So when if you open this can of worms, when politics is done – these things are moving to their restricted status. So if people say, are our gun laws too strict? I would think that if you owned a lot of semi-automatic rifles now, you would want to let this one lie because as it stands, most of them are non-restricted. And that actually tends to less restriction than will, I think, inevitably occur when politics gets done.
As a prediction, I'm inclined to agree with you, at least that's a major possibility. But as far as what you'd actually like to see, do you think the 1022s we were talking about earlier should be restricted?
Well, that's a 22, so it's a little bit different.
But if we go to that line of semi-automatic is the line that we're going to draw in the sand.
If the line in the sand is drawn around semi-automatic and well, first of all, I would say a semi-automatic is not always a semi-automatic. Mm-hmm. You know, a semi-automatic shotgun, which is used by 2/3 of the duck hunters in Canada, is much slower to load, doesn't present the same risk as interchangeable.
You should have seen the guys at the shotgun match this weekend.
Well, it's still – I mean, there's a reason why interchangeable magazines are the standard for the military. It's just faster and easier to handle.
My shotgun's tube load.
Ammo, right? So
it's just a matter of technique. We load shotguns very quickly these days. It's a matter of technique and technology. It's not box fed. I shoot a Benelli M2.
Essentially, John's now arguing to treat all semi-automatics the same, where I'm saying
all guns.
Only some should be treated differently.
I want to look at the people, not the gun.
But, you know, if you ask me where those should be classified, I am going to boldly express just about no opinion because it really is – it's just a highly politicized thing. What do I think should be done with them? Well, I don't think they should be thrown into the restricted class as it exists today because some of the valid uses for these things with a 5-round magazine can include going hunting. People use some of these rifles for that purpose. So there are valid purposes that would be taken away by throwing them in the restricted can. On the other hand, leaving them non-restricted, there are good arguments not to do that as well, which is why I think that when politics happens, they would get restricted. So that is one area where we would have to, to my mind, to come up with a reasonable solution, we would actually have to change our classification scheme.
All right, we've got to take a break. When we come back, we'll have just a couple of moments to wrap things up here on the Andrew Lawton Show gun control debate here on AM 980. Stay tuned.
You're listening to the Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980.
We are back. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980. We only have a couple of moments left with our guests here, but I wanted to give them each the chance to wrap things up and give sort of a final thought, a final idea, final jab at the other. I don't know. We've all been pretty friendly, which is fun. We started with John, so we'll let AJ have the last word here. But John, how do you wrap things up here? I mean, the question, are Canada's gun laws too strict? We've talked about classifications. We've talked about some of the other things. What's the takeaway you want to leave people with?
Well, I'm actually quite impressed that AJ agreed on so many points. It comes down to how much we want to have and why we want to do it. And he thinks there should be restrictions in place to control me. I don't want it to be controlled because I want to control the criminal element. The firearm has nothing to do with it. It's use. It's the human behind the trigger that matters, and we need to target that. Spend the money, spend the resource in the police on targeting criminal activity. Leave the good law-abiding citizen who is trained, who is qualified, leave us alone. and I want to live my life. I want to enjoy my sport, my pastime. And I do encourage, as we've talked offline, about the increase in the shooting sports in Canada. We've seen increases in range memberships, new ranges being built. We're coming back from the brink, and I'm really happy to see that.
AJ, last word to you.
Well, shooting sports are growing, which is good. Good thing. And it's a sign that our laws aren't actually too strict. If I could leave you with one parting thought, it's that people feel our laws are too strict because we are reacting to what has happened in the past, and we are reacting to some of the ways those laws are enforced or spoken about, rather than thinking about what the laws themselves do. The laws here are not the problem. Our laws are fairly effective and not too onerous on gun owners, but it's our reaction to them. We're not thinking about our laws, we're feeling about our laws, and we react emotionally and just push back when we don't need to.
AJ Somerset, author of the book Arms, The Culture and Credo of the Gun. John Evers, a director at the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Both of you gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.
Right, thank you.
All right, back in a moment. Your calls on what you think of the question, the debate, all of that. Up next, 519-643-2222. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980.